Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. Thanks so much for joining us for another busy week where we have bungled ballots from elections BC. We're going to talk a bit about that and how to get to the bottom of some shaken confidence in our electoral system, and also a little bit about the U.S. election and some of the themes coming out of that apply in the wake of the BC election. So make sure you subscribe to our podcast for additional content. We're also on YouTube and CHEK Plus. Let us bring in the panel here. Allie Blades, Jeff Ferrier, Jillian Oliver, here each and every week to break down BC politics. But we're just going to start with American politics. And the surprise, I guess, we can debate whether it was a surprising victory of Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, now going into his second term as president, also a convicted felon who is facing legal action and all sorts of things, not deterring the American public from voting for him in increased numbers, and despite all of the sort of rhetoric from the Democrats, not influencing voters as well. And I think let's just start with that. Let's go around on that issue. And we had similar discussions after the BC election. The idea of calling your opponent unfit for office and crazy and racist didn't seem to influence voters there very much, Allie. And here we are in the U.S. election seeing a very similar phenomenon.
Yeah, I'll start by saying the Canadian elections and American elections are totally different. There's been a bit of a conversation this week of now that there's a right-leaning president in the United States, does this open a door for the next general election in Canada for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives? The answer is absolutely not. The two campaigns are not the same in any way whatsoever, except for they're both laser focused on this affordability issue, like the lives of their respective voters, and making it better, where their opponents, on the other hand, will resort to some name calling and the definition of their character. This one was a very interesting observation because the polling indicated in the United States, and granted, like polling in the United States is a whole different beast. Mm-hmm. It's more pay to play, and whoever has the most money is going to get that favorable response. But all throughout, they said it was neck and neck. And look at Trump, an overwhelming victory and control of absolutely everything. And a lot of that, I think, goes back to my original point where he was talking about making life more affordable, a focus on making things in the United States, and back to a focus on the American people. And so that's, I think, the only overlap that we can kind of learn from is, well, if we stay focused on the issues that voters are, then we could get them mobilized to go out to vote.
Mm-hmm. Also, though, the overlap of the rural-urban divide in the United States, and Jillian, as our resident rural correspondent from Nelson, perhaps you can speak to the urban-rural divide, in the province. It seems like not just here, but the United States and even maybe federally, that disconnect between two types of voters from the population centers and then from those outside who have kind of different thoughts and priorities.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because we see a similar trend where, both Trump and John Rustad went really hard on the public safety issue, speaking in very negative dystopian terms about what's happening in cities. But people in the cities voted for the NDP and for the Democrats. And so it's interesting because I think it's almost like on that issue in particular, there's sort of like a perception gap on how bad things are in urban areas, and two kind of very different visions. I think that's something that was another parallel, thinking back to our debate, as well as the American debate, Trump and Restad having this very, very dark, very negative view of the country or the province of where things are at, and the Democrats and the NDP trying to have a bit more of like a hopeful, positive message. And I think those speaking to really divided sentiments of where different groups of people are at. I think in addition to the urban-rural divide, you see a lot of similar demographic trends, younger, more male voters voting more right-wing, big split along education lines, a lot of demographic trends that I think are really similar and kind of speak to how sort of globalized our information environment is. People, I think for a long time, Canadian politics didn't really look like American politics because people were still more tuned into the mainstream media produced in Canada. But that's really changed in the past couple of years, where a lot of people are looking at alternative media, people really siloed. And I think that accounts for how different people are sort of experiencing and seeing the world. And I think is contributing to how polarized things are. So I think, more than ever, it's really interesting to see how similar our politics now are to the US, when I don't think that that's been the case in the past.
Yeah, two silos, two sides, Jeff, increasingly unable to see why the other side would support the person they're supporting. Like there's just no ability to kind of look at someone who might vote for John Rustad or Donald Trump as a New Democrat or Green and say, I understand why they're doing that. And vice versa, which makes it tough to really kind of read the electorate.
Yeah, the electorate's growing more and more entrenched into immovable factions, and that changes the dynamics of campaigns here. I want to go back to something that Allie said about name calling. I don't think that, I think that's a bit of a false narrative. Like no one called John Rustad the goof from Vanderhoof, right? That's the word on him in Victoria. No one would say that. That would be disrespectful. It's more about values and people demanding accountability from people for the words that they spoke. But Allie's also quite right that then in the U.S. and here in British Columbia, we saw conservatives surge because they spoke to the value issue that working class people care about the most, and that is the value in their bank account at the end of the month, rather than whether democracy is at risk or what is the leadership and character of people. So, and as much as progressives focus on what I would call elite issues. And this electoral cycle and climate doesn't work well for them. So they need to move off that. I'd also point out a couple other ways that the campaigns were very similar. One is language. We saw from conservatives and Trump in the States, clear, sharp, emotive language. We saw that here from the conservatives in British Columbia. And we heard from progressives overwrought, overwritten language that they seem to be talking sometimes to a university seminar rather than people in their day-to-day life. And there's an issue of culture too, right? I mean, there's you saw Trump at NASCAR. You saw Trump at country music concerts. You saw him at football games. You didn't see Democrats there. You saw them on stage with Cardi B and Lady Gaga and other celebrities. And I think there's a similarly in BC an absence of the NDP and progressives at football games, country music concerts. There's a big pro wrestling show coming up in Vancouver on November the 30th. It's the Survivor Series War Games. You think David Eby is going to be there with working class people? There's people holding up signs that say Scott Road, right? And that's the folks who are there. And if someone suggested that Eby should be there, that person would probably be fired, right? So there's that culture issue too. So it's for me, there's lots of similarities and lots of global trends that you can see playing out in both BC and the United States.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, there's lessons to be learned from the kind of successes and failures of the BC election and the American election in terms of talking to the public, and you guys have done a good job outlining that for us. as we're recording this on Friday morning, we don't yet have the judicial recount results from Surrey, Guildford, or the other two, in total 3 judicial recounts that are ongoing. We don't expect them to actually change the results, but they have brought up and highlighted some concerning sort of developments from Elections BC in the last week or so. An entire box of missing ballots discovered in Prince George, more than 800 votes, and then more than 700 votes due to tabulation errors and paper miscounting and things like that in 69 electoral ridings, leading to the weird situation where we discovered there were 28 miscounted or misplaced ballots in Surrey, Guildford, a riding the NDP won or appear to be winning by 27 votes. So more misplaced ballots than the margin of victory. When they were counted, the number went down to 21, and after the judicial recount, we'll get a different number, still expected to likely be an NDP victory in that riding. But man, Jillian, not good. I don't think. I'm watching this going, we've never had a missing box of ballots before. Even Elections BC admits that. But what do we do with this information, and how do we sort of process it, do you think?
Well, I think, there's a bunch of different calls for how to move forward on this. I think one thing that's important to note is that there were a bunch of changes put in between the last 2 elections that Elections BC is kind of grappling with. They were changes that they mostly proposed. But sometimes when there's changes, there's unforeseen mistakes. And I think that's kind of what happened here, that they weren't able to plan for every situation. But it is concerning given how quickly mistrust can sort of take hold in institutions these days. The Conservatives want a independent review, arm's length from politicians. The NDP and the Greens have proposed an all-party committee. I think both are good options. I think they should both, be transparent, and fulsome. I think I do like the all-party committee because I think that having the opportunity for all parties to achieve consensus can help to guard against politicization if it's done correctly. I think, it's really important, given the shape of the legislature, that committee be a minority committee where the government doesn't have a majority, so that they can achieve that consensus and that there is kind of, that shared buy-in, so that when we get to the next election, all of the parties can be on the same page and we don't kind of open ourselves up to politicization of the process in that sort of hyper-political moment of a campaign. But yeah, I think, there's lots of questions that need to be answered and they should be done transparently.
Yeah, it's actually a good point. Once again, in the middle of recording shows, I learn things listening to Jillian, but I had sort of viewed the all-party committee as the lesser option because of the most likely potential the NDP would dominate it, and the politicians would all get to the table and sort of be unable to agree. But if they could agree together, you would produce a guard, as you say, a kind of a consensus amongst all parties for reforms that they can't then say were the wrong things to do later, Allie. And so actually, as Jillian says that out loud, I think maybe we could do both somehow,
I know, it's listen to Jillian always. But you got a point. It's about communicating it, and it's the platform that our elected representatives have as well, that versus Elections BC. Now, granted, Elections BC has the nonpartisan perspective to it, but other than during election periods, are we really watching the Elections BC Twitter as much as we are right now? And so the platform of the MLAs taking charge of the narrative and pushing this out, that's smart. It's concerning, to Jillian's point, but it's not a conspiracy. And I do want to talk about this because I think the social conversation about this is, well, this was done intentional or on purpose. And this human error that Elections BC was talking about, this was not done maliciously to for a grander scheme. Human errors always happen during campaigns. I mean, look at the United States. They're still counting ballots, right? These were projections that we saw on election night, and they have a longer process. Going back to BC, we're constantly evolving how we count our ballots and get the information out to the public as quickly as possible. And this is what we experienced this time with the electronic scanners. But we should always strive to, in every cycle, try to make it better for the next. And so I anticipate that that'll happen for the next election.
Mm-hmm. Jeff,
Rob,
elections BC.
Elections BC. Yeah, look, Rob, after the 2017 election, you wrote a book called "The Matter of Confidence." I think if you wrote one about elections BC, you would call it a matter of competence. It's I trust the results of the election. I appreciate the time that all of the workers put in, 12, 14-hour days. But elections BC screwed up in this election. Finding ballot boxes that you didn't count on election day. It seems like from each new day, there's new ballots that we find somewhere. It's not a conspiracy, as Allie points out. It's just poor performance by folks at election BC. They have one job, and that's to make sure that people write an X on a ballot, that the ballot goes into a box, and then we get to keep all the boxes, and we open the boxes, and we count the ballots. The CEO makes almost $400,000 a year, and you've been hearing nothing from the guy but excuses when he's got 4 years to get ready for this stuff. So I like the idea of the all-party committee. Legislators at the end of the day are responsible for elections BC through legislation. They are within their rights to call experts to examine and review, so you can have that outside perspective. But at the end of the day, I think this is something that all parties have to come together and say, here's how we do better, or else the result of it won't be legitimate, as Jillian points out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's too bad we can't do both. The reason why we don't have MLAs investigate everything is because, they politic.
There's no biases. MLAs are always looking for not the party's interest, the public interest all the time.
But that's why we usually hire a judge for a public inquiry or something like that. We sort of put it out. But you are right that Elections BC reports to the legislature. Its CEO and chief electoral officer should stand before the legislature and answer for this thing. But at the same time, maybe an outside set of eyes to sort of get into the mechanics of it would work too. And as Jillian pointed out, if you can get all the parties on the same page, then we're really in a better. And credit to the Conservative Party, who have been moving mountains internally to try and hold off the conspiracy theories, speaking publicly about their confidence in the system at all levels, including the leader. They could have very easily turned this into a piñata, and they have not so far. So
not yet.
That's good. not yet.
Fingers crossed it holds.
Yes.
Yeah.
We heard from Premier David Eby this week that the cabinet is going to be sworn in on November 18th. We don't know who is going to be in the cabinet, and obviously we never really know until Cabinet Day at Government House when it is unveiled. But that does not stop us from speculating. Speculating out the wazoo is what we do. That makes it sound pretty bad, but we're speculating anyways about what could be the cabinet makeup. There's diversity, regional considerations, gender considerations, experience considerations, all sorts of vacancies. We have more than 12 vacancies due to retirements and resignations. So how does the Premier begin to construct this cabinet, Allie? If you're him or you're watching this, what do people need to take away from that?
Well, the biggest takeaways, obviously, the regional perspective, I think, is going to be massive, i.e., I think he's going to be held accountable for that if it's all representation from the Lower Mainland. The fact that we've elected record-breaking new MLAs as well. So not only are they new to the job, but then there's potential that they get a massive promotion on day one of being a cabinet minister. To the viewers and the listeners, obviously, I have no line of sight as to what the NDP are doing. But what I can say is that with the opposition, what's going to happen after the cabinet gets announced is for the Conservatives, they're going to announce their shadow cabinet. And I think this is going to be really fun to watch because every single time I talk to a new MLA on the Conservative caucus side, they are fired up. And so, with the learnings of what the rules are within the legislature, I think they are going to be on top of it. The criticism the last time was that the BC United wasn't as strong of an opposition. That's not the case this time, folks.
Yeah, I thought they were pretty strong as an opposition. Maybe as a party, they fell down a bit, but in the legislature, United did a pretty able job, I thought. But yeah, you're right. It'll be a fascinating shadow cabinet critic thing as well. Jillian, what do you think?
Well, like you said, they lost a lot of cabinet ministers through retirements and through a handful of them losing their seats as well. So it's going to be a big change in cabinet no matter what. I think, the big portfolios are always the most interesting. The finance minister retired. That's probably the most important minister because they control the purse strings. So that's going to be really interesting to see. Is it a newer MLA? Is it more of a veteran? Is it somebody that's going to be really empowered or someone that's going to work really closely with the premier? It's going to be really interesting to see who goes there. And then I think health is going to be one of the most interesting ones to watch. We heard the premier talk about how some of the negative outcomes that we've seen in the healthcare system, ER closures and that sort of a thing are one of the things that he really heard from the public. I think Adrian Dix is an extremely knowledgeable health minister, but it'll be interesting to see if the premier decides to make a change there to send a strong signal that he heard the public that it's time to do things differently.
Yeah. Jeff, you have the inside track. You know what the cabinet's going to be. Just give us the top 7.
Well, Rob, you're going to be named the Minister of Finance.
Oh my God, that's a nightmare. You wake up screaming. You're like, no.
And meanwhile, I've already sold all of my assets in British Columbia as a result. No, I have no inside information on what's happening in cabinet. My advice to the NDP is to first and foremost focus on who your best athletes are in the field, right? And assign them to the big roles. Set some priorities and put good people in those. And it's finance, health, public safety, housing, mental health and addictions, and economic development. The latter because we're facing a time of a new regime south of the border with our biggest trading partner where they're protectionist and we're a commodity exporting province, and our economy and our prosperity is going to depend on how we manage that working with the federal government. I think gender balance is important. I think regional considerations will absolutely be taken into account. But this government and this premier needs to put six high performers in those roles and give them all of the resources and backing that they need to address the issues that voters said the government's not doing good enough on. And, the rest will work itself out.
Thank you to the panel for being here. Thank you for watching and listening. Make sure you subscribe, and we will be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.